His breath was warm against my neck as I reached for the flower on the high shelf. "Let me help you with that," Claude whispered, his chest pressing against my back as he stretched over me. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the stove light, and in that moment, I forgot everything. My husband sleeping upstairs, the wedding ring on my finger, every reason why this was wrong. His fingers brushed mine as he handed me the container, and I felt heat spread through my entire body like wildfire. Quick pause before we dive deeper. If you're enjoying this steamy start, hit that like button and subscribe. Let me know when they buy you. Comments what's got you hooked already. Now, let's continue. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Simon's steady breathing from our bedroom upstairs. He'd been working double shifts at the plant, coming home exhausted every night for the past month. Tonight was no different. He'd collapsed into bed at 9, barely managing a kiss goodnight before sleep claimed him. I should have gone to bed, too, but restlessness kept me awake. That's when I heard movement in the kitchen. Claude had been staying with us for 2 weeks now, ever since his apartment flooded. My stepfather, though that word felt strange since he'd only married my mother, when I was already 25, and she'd passed just 3 years later. He was more like a family friend who'd never quite left our lives. "Couldn't sleep either?" I asked softly as I padded into the kitchen in my thin nightgown, my bare feet silent on the cool tiles. He turned from where he stood at the counter, his salt and pepper hair tousled, wearing only pajama bottoms that hung low on his hips. At 56, Claude carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from experience. His eyes, a deep blue that seemed to see right through me, met mine across the dimly lit space. "Thought I'd try my hand at that bread recipe your mother used to make," he said, his voice low and gravelly in the quiet night. I found her old cookbook in the boxes I brought from storage. My heart tightened at the mention of Mom, but there was something else, too, a flutter in my stomach as I watched his hands work the dough, strong and sure. She always made the best bread. I never could get the hang of it. "Come here," he said, not looking up from his work. "I'll show you." I moved closer, close enough to smell his subtle cologne mixed with something distinctly masculine. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. He positioned himself behind me, his hands covering mine as he guided them through the kneading motion. "Feel how the dough responds," he murmured, his breath tickling my ear. "You have to be firm, but gentle, patient." His chest pressed against my back as he showed me the technique, and I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. My breathing grew shallow as his hands moved with mine, our fingers intertwining in the soft, warm dough. Every nerve ending seemed alive, hyper-aware of his proximity. "Like this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Perfect," he breathed, and I felt something shift between us, an electric tension that had been building for days without either of us acknowledging. Had the dough forgotten? I turned in his arms, finding myself pressed between his warm body and the cool counter. His eyes searched mine in the dim light, and I saw my own desire reflected there. This was dangerous territory, forbidden ground that neither of us should cross. "April," he said softly, my name sounding different on his lips than it ever had before. "We shouldn't," but his hands were already moving to my waist, his thumbs tracing small circles through the thin fabric of my nightgown. I shivered at his touch, my body responding in ways that made my marriage vows feel like distant memories. "I know," I whispered, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, my hands flat against his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin through the sparse hair that covered his muscled torso. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but they were drowned out by the thundering of my pulse and the way his presence seemed to fill every corner of my awareness. His fingers trailed up my sides, barely touching, but leaving trails of fire in their wake. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. I've tried not to notice, tried to be respectful, but his confession hung in the air between us, heavy with possibility and danger. My hands moved upward, tracing the contours of his shoulders, feeling the tension coiled there. "Claude," I breathed, his name a prayer and a confession all at once. His control snapped, his mouth crashed against mine, hungry and desperate, and I melted into him completely. The kiss was nothing like the perfunctory pecks I exchanged with Simon. This was raw, consuming, a meeting of souls that had been denied too long. I gasped against his lips as he lifted me onto the counter, his hands spanning my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space between us. My legs wrapped around him instinctively, and I felt his sharp intake of breath as our bodies aligned. "God, April," he groaned against my throat, his lips finding that sensitive spot just below my ear that made me arch against him. "I've wanted this for so long." His confession sent shockwaves through me. The careful distance he'd maintained, the way he'd sometimes catch himself looking at me, it all made sense now. And I realized with startling clarity that I'd wanted this too, had been drawn to him in ways I'd refused to acknowledge. His hands found the hem of my nightgown, fingers trailing along my thighs with reverent touches that made me tremble. Every caress was deliberate, worshipful, as if he was memorizing the feel of my skin. "Tell me to stop," he whispered against my lips, even as his hands continued their exploration. "Tell me this is wrong, and I'll walk away right now." But I couldn't. The words wouldn't come because every fiber of my being was alive with need, with a desire that transcended logic or morality. Instead, I pulled him closer, my fingers tangling in his hair as I claimed his mouth with mine. He responded with a growl of surrender, his hands becoming bolder, more possessive. The cool granite of the counter contrasted sharply with the heat of his body as he pressed against me, and I could feel his own need matching mine. My nightgown slipped higher, bunching around my waist as his hands mapped every curve, every hollow. His touch was electric, sending jolts of pleasure through my system that made me gasp and arch into him. "You feel so good," he murmured, his voice strained with control that was rapidly slipping away. "So perfect." His fingers found sensitive spots that made me cry out softly, my head falling back as waves of sensation washed over me. I was lost in him, in the way he touched me like I was something precious and forbidden all at once. The kitchen became our world, shadowed and secret, filled only with the sound of our breathing and the whispered endearments that fell from his lips like prayers. His mouth blazed a trail down my throat, across my collarbone, each kiss marking me as his in ways that went beyond the physical. My body responded to him with an intensity that should have frightened me. Every nerve was alight, every touch magnified, until I felt like I might shatter from the pleasure of it. His hands were everywhere, exploring, caressing, building a fire inside me that threatened to consume everything in its path. "I need you," I whispered against his ear, surprising myself with the raw honesty of it. "Please, Claude." He pulled back to look at me, his eyes dark with desire and something deeper, a tenderness that made my heart ache. "Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, I'm sure," I breathed, and I was. In that moment, nothing else existed but this need, this connection that felt both inevitable and earth-shattering. His hands became more urgent then, and I felt the last of his restraint crumble. He positioned himself between my thighs, and I felt the warmth of him, the promise of connection that would change everything between us. When he finally joined with me, I had to bite my lip to keep from crying out. The sensation was overwhelming, not just the physical pleasure, though that was intense enough to make me see stars, but the emotional connection that seemed to link us soul to soul. He moved slowly at first, his forehead pressed against mine, both of us adjusting to this new intimacy. His breathing was ragged, controlled, as if he was holding back a flood of sensation. "So tight," he whispered, his voice strained. "So perfect for me." I moved with him, finding a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. The counter beneath me was hard and cool, but his body above me was warm and solid, an anchor in the storm of sensation that threatened to overwhelm me. Our movements grew more urgent, more desperate, as the need built between us. I could feel myself climbing toward something magnificent, something that would shatter me completely and rebuild me as someone new. His name fell from my lips like a mantra as he drove into me with increasing intensity. Every thrust sent spirals of pleasure through my core, building toward an inevitable crescendo that left me breathless with anticipation. "Let go for me," he whispered against my ear, his voice commanding and tender all at once. "I want to feel you come apart in my arms." His words were my undoing. The climax hit me like a wave, stealing my breath and making my body arch against his as pleasure crashed over me in endless ripples. I felt him follow moments later, his own release making him groan my name like a prayer. We stayed locked together for long moments afterward, both of us struggling to catch our breath. The reality of what we'd done began to seep in around the edges of my consciousness, but I pushed it away, not ready to face the consequences yet. His hand stroked my hair with infinite gentleness as my breathing slowly returned to normal. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his concern evident in every word. I nodded against his shoulder, not trusting my voice yet. What we'd shared was so far beyond okay that I didn't have words for it. It was transcendent, life-altering, terrifying, in its intensity. "I should go," he said finally, though he made no move to pull away from me. "Not yet," I whispered, tightening my arms around him. "Just not yet." He held me closer, and we stayed like that as the kitchen slowly lightened with the approach of dawn. The spell was breaking, reality creeping back in, but for these stolen moments, we were suspended in time, two souls who had found something precious and forbidden in the quiet darkness. Eventually, though, the sound of movement from upstairs reminded us both of the world beyond this kitchen, beyond this moment. Simon was stirring, would be down for coffee soon. Claude pulled back reluctantly, his hands framing my face as he looked into my eyes. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. I should have had regrets. I should have been drowning in guilt and shame. But, looking into his eyes, feeling the tenderness in his touch, I found I couldn't summon those emotions. "No regrets," I whispered back, and meant it. We separated slowly, reluctantly, both of us adjusting our clothing and trying to restore some semblance of normalcy to the kitchen. The bread dough sat forgotten on the counter, an innocent witness to our transgression. "I'll clean this up," Claude said, his voice carefully neutral now, though his eyes still held heat when they met mine. I nodded and slipped out of the kitchen, my legs unsteady as I made my way back upstairs. Simon was still sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that the world had shifted on its axis while he dreamed. I slipped back into bed beside my husband, but sleep eluded me. Every nerve ending still hummed with the memory of Claude's touch, and I found myself reliving every moment of our encounter. The guilt I'd expected to feel was overshadowed by a deep satisfaction, a sense of having awakened to something I hadn't even known I was missing. The next morning passed in a haze of normalcy that felt surreal. Simon got up, showered, kissed me goodbye, and left for work, just like every other day. Claude emerged from the guest room as I was making coffee, and for a moment our eyes met across the kitchen. The memory of what had happened on that very counter hung between us, electric and undeniable. He moved closer, and I felt that same magnetic pull that had drawn us together the night before. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice carrying undertones that made my pulse quicken. "Morning," I replied, my own voice breathier than I intended. He moved past me to pour himself coffee, but his hand brushed mine as he reached for the mug, and the simple contact sent fire racing through my veins. This was dangerous. We were playing with forces that could destroy everything we both held dear. But as I watched him move around the kitchen with easy familiarity, as I caught him looking at me with eyes that held heat and promise, I realized that what had happened between us wasn't a one-time mistake born of loneliness and opportunity. It was the beginning of something that would change everything. The days that followed were a careful dance of stolen glances and accidental touches. We were hyper-aware of each other, the air crackling with tension whenever we were in the same room. Simon, wrapped up in his work stress, noticed nothing, but I noticed everything. The way Claude's jaw tightened when Simon kissed me goodbye. The way his eyes followed me as I moved around the house. The careful distance he maintained, as if he didn't trust himself to get too close. 3 days after our kitchen encounter, Simon announced he'd be working an overnight shift at the plant. A rare occurrence, but one that meant Claude and I would be alone in the house for an entire night. "I'll probably crash at the plant," Simon said as he packed his overnight bag. "No point in driving home at dawn just to turn around and come back." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral, but my pulse was racing. Claude appeared in the Yahoo doorway just as Simon was leaving, and the look that passed between us was charged with possibility. "Drive safe," I called to Simon, my voice only slightly strained. The door closed behind him, and suddenly the house felt different, charged with anticipation and the memory of forbidden pleasures. "We shouldn't," Claude said quietly, but he was already moving toward me. "I know," I whispered, but I was moving toward him too, drawn by a force stronger than conscience or common sense. When we came together this time, it was with the desperate hunger of people who had been starving without realizing it. His mouth claimed mine with an intensity that left me breathless, his hands tangling in my hair as he backed me against the wall. "I've thought about nothing but you," he confessed against my lips. "Every night, knowing you're just down the hall with him." His words sent shivers through me because I'd been thinking the same thing. Every night lying next to Simon, I'd been remembering Claude's touch, craving it with an intensity that scared me. "Take me to bed," I whispered, and his eyes darkened with desire. He lifted me into his arms, carrying me up the stairs to the guest room, neutral territory that didn't belong to Simon and me. The bed was smaller than my marriage bed, but it felt infinite as he laid me down with reverent care. This time we had all night. There was no rush, no fear of discovery, just endless hours to explore this connection that had ignited between us. He worshipped my body with his hands and mouth, learning every secret place that made me gasp and arch beneath him. I returned the favor, mapping the landscape of his body with fingertips and lips, marveling at the way he responded to my touch. He was beautifully masculine, his body telling the story of his years in ways that fascinated me. When he finally moved over me, settling between my thighs with exquisite care, I felt like I was coming home to a place I'd never known existed. The connection was even more intense than before, if that was possible, and I lost myself completely in the rhythm we created together. We made love with a passion that consumed everything in its path, then lay tangled together in the aftermath, our breathing slowly returning to normal. But instead of separating, we stayed close, talking in whispered voices about everything and nothing. "This is dangerous," he said as his fingers traced patterns on my bare shoulder. "I know," I replied, but I made no move to leave his arms. "We can't keep doing this." "I know that too." But even as we spoke the words, we both knew they were lies. This thing between us was too powerful to be denied, too perfect to be given up willingly. We made love twice more that night, each time more intense than the last, as if we were trying to pour a lifetime of passion into these stolen hours. By dawn, we were both exhausted and sated, but also more connected than ever. Simon returned home that evening, tired but in good spirits, completely oblivious to how the landscape of his marriage had shifted in his absence. I cooked dinner, made conversation, played the role of dutiful wife, but part of me remained with Claude, remembering the way he'd held me, the words he'd whispered in the darkness. The following week brought a cruel kind of normalcy. Claude found a new apartment and prepared to move out, and though we both knew it was for the best, the thought of him leaving felt like losing a limb. On his last night in our house, we found ourselves alone again. Simon had fallen asleep early, exhausted from another long day. Claude and I sat in the living room, ostensibly watching television, but really just stealing glances at each other and remembering. "I'll miss this," he said quietly, and I knew he wasn't talking about the house. "Me too," I whispered. He looked at me then, his eyes intense in the lamplight. "Come with me." The words hung in the air between us, impossible and tempting. For a moment, I let myself imagine it, leaving Simon, starting over with Claude, building a life based on this incredible connection we'd discovered. But reality crashed back, reminding me of vows made and lives built, of the impossibility of throwing away everything for passion, no matter how transcendent. "I can't," I said, the words breaking my heart even as I spoke them. He nodded, understanding but disappointed. I had to ask. We made love one last time that night in the guest room that had become our sanctuary. It was bittersweet, colored by the knowledge that it was goodbye. Every touch was memorized, every kiss treasured, as we tried to pack a lifetime of loving into these final hours. In the morning, he packed his belongings and loaded them into his truck while Simon was at work. I stood in the doorway, watching him prepare to leave, both of us knowing this was the end. "I love you," he said simply as he climbed into the driver's seat. "I love you too," I replied, and meant it completely. He drove away without looking back, and I stood there until his truck disappeared around the corner. Then I went inside and tried to figure out how to return to a life that would never feel quite the same again. That was 6 months ago. Simon and I are still married, still going through the motions of our life together. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I find myself remembering Claude's touch, his whispered words, the way he made me feel alive in ways I'd never experienced before. I know I should feel guilty, should regret what happened between us. But I don't. Those stolen nights showed me parts of myself I'd never known existed, depths of passion and connection I'd never dreamed possible. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to leave with him. Would we have built something lasting, or would the intensity have burned itself out without the forbidden nature that made it so powerful? I'll never know, but I carry those memories like precious gems, hidden treasures that make even ordinary days shimmer, with the memory of extraordinary love. And late at night, when Simon sleeps soundly beside me, I sometimes allow myself to wonder if Claude remembers too, if he lies awake thinking about the woman who chose duty over desire, security over soul-deep connection. I tell myself it was the right choice, the responsible choice. But my heart knows the truth, that some connections transcend morality and marriage vows, that some loves are worth any price. The question that haunts me is whether I'll ever be brave enough to pay it. So tell me, have you ever felt a connection so powerful it made you question everything you thought you knew about yourself? What did you do when faced with choosing between duty and desire? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely curious about your experiences. And before you go, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the notification bell because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Things are about to get even more intense. See you in the next one.